Welcome everyone to our meeting on AI and advances in quantum information sciences or quantum computing, et cetera. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to welcome Michael Kratsios, who has a thoroughly intimidating title of the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. So I think we've come to the right place to engage this important subject. As you know, the administration has taken a very energetic position in trying to advance the state of the art in both the applications of artificial intelligence and the quantum information sciences to our non-defense applications. There are parallel efforts of substantial scale in the Department of Defense through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and other defense entities, because these technologies are indeed of universal applications. So I'd like to take the opportunity to begin the discussion with Michael to perhaps start with a bit of current news where Europe has, the European Union in particular, has tabled some of their ideas about how to manage some of the, particularly the ethical issues relating to the use of artificial intelligence. We've had, of course, quite a number of years of tension on a transatlantic basis about the application of advanced technologies to commercial as well as governmental applications. So be interested in getting your take on this, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much to Hudson for having me here, and thank you for this conversation. Yeah, so yesterday was a big day of news for the world of AI regulation. As you probably know, the United States was kind of first out of the gate in January, where we proposed the AI regulatory principles, and those are out for comment. And then since then, the EU yesterday has released their attempt to do what we did in January, with providing some sort of structure around the way they're thinking about regulations of AI-powered technologies in the European Union. So I think our kind of take is sort of twofold. I think we're very encouraged to see a lot of focus in their document on the importance of fostering an innovation ecosystem that is friendly to artificial intelligence technologies. They talk a lot about the importance of developing and working on research and development type projects and helping drive startups and small SMEs, as they call it, or startups or smaller companies to work in this space. And they also talk very much about a values-based approach, one that the United States expressed when we put out our principles in January. But the one thing I do think is important to flag, and one thing where I think there could be some room for improvement, is their next step from taking this sort of values-based approach and actually implementing it. What we found, what they actually put out yesterday, really I think does in some ways sort of clumsily attempts to bucket AI-powered technologies as either high risk or not high risk. So the way that their proposed regulatory scheme is structured, there will be some sort of group of some kind in Europe that will make some sort of decision on whether or not a technology is high risk or not. And then if you are high risk, you have to go through a pretty extensive regulatory approach. If you are not high risk, you don't have to do anything. We believe this sort of all or nothing approach is not necessarily the best way to approach regulating AI technologies. We think that AI regulation is best sort of serves on a spectrum of sorts. There are certain types of technologies, AI-powered technologies, which will require heavy regulatory scrutiny, and we in the United States are prepared to do that. But there are quite a few that need just a little or not at all, and I think creating the spectrum is important. So I think that's kind of where our biggest concern is, and I'll be traveling to Brussels next month, and speaking to folks over there and kind of sharing some of these concerns. I think there's a lot we have in common, but I think this approach of very sort of bluntly bifurcating the entire R&D to the entire AI tech ecosystem into two buckets is a little bit harsh.
I think it's a very good point, and as you may know, I will also serve on the DoD Defense Science Board, and we've done studies on the application of modern technology to the development of both AI and quantum. And one of the opportunities that may evolve as the technology improves to facilitate better alignment with our allies in Europe is an effort that's underway in DARPA to develop explainable AI, so that the user of the outcome or output of an AI based bit of an analysis is able to understand the coupling between the outcome and the data that produced the outcome. And we're of course not there yet, but there may be some opportunities for research collaboration between the U.S. and the EU to perhaps better solve this problem of explainable AI. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's sort of it's a good segue into sort of how the U.S. approach in some ways differs a little bit to the European. I think when we put out our principles last January, they sort of focus on sort of three main themes. And I think one of them hits directly on this explainability question. I think on the first go around, I think that the most important thing in the U.S. model is public engagement. Whenever we attempt to be pursuing some kind of regulatory action of any kind towards a private sector company that's implementing an AI-powered technology, we as the federal government have some experts, but the community is the people who know this best. They have the scientists and technologists and the experts who can help us think through that. So there's a lot of emphasis in our framework on public engagement. The second key is really around limited regulatory overreach. We believe that we need to create a model that is risk-based and use-based and sector-specific. So the types of regulations that you may have for an autonomous vehicle or for a drone is very different for necessarily the type of regulation you will have for an AI-powered medical diagnostic. And rather than sort of bucketing the technologies as, well, those are all high risk, so you have to do these 12 things, or these are not high risk, you don't have to do anything, there has to be a bit of a spectrum and flexibility in the model so that you're able to actually regulate appropriately for the risks that each of those technologies provide. And the third, which I think you bring up very astutely, is this idea of promoting trustworthy AI. This is something we deeply care about, and we need to engender trust in the American people and the technologies that they are using. And we need to create a regulatory model that allows that trust to be built. And having better R&D and better technology around issues like explainability, I think will get us a lot closer to that place.
Good. One of the issues that's related to this that's coming fast upon us is the interaction between AI and the Internet of Things. The Science Board has been doing some work on the technologies of autonomy and counter-autonomy, and obviously the AI technology is one of the things that's going to make IoT work for the whole society. So there may also be some opportunities for collaboration with our EU colleagues on trying to understand how we will manage the introduction of IoT, because like other applications of where AI is involved, the range of applications is extraordinarily diverse.
I couldn't agree more, and I think where we have sort of manifested that type of thinking in our approach is actually through the first large White House summit we held on artificial intelligence was very intentionally titled AI for American Industry. And we were trying to express when we were hosting this event was that artificial intelligence is going to touch every industry in the United States, whether you are doing oil extraction in Texas, whether you are doing farming in Iowa, whether you're doing biotech in Boston, you will be using this technology to drive your business. And if the U.S. wants to lead the world in artificial intelligence, we need to make sure that all of those industries are able to capture the benefits that artificial intelligence can provide. So being able to kind of have that very important dialogue with our allies around the world on how we can move all of these industries forward, utilizing this technology is absolutely critical.
Right. One of the, let's say, news items that's been a pretty constant drumbeat for the past half dozen years or so has been China's alignment of its perception of its national and security interests with investments in advanced technology. They announced their Made in China 25 initiative 5 years or so ago, which identified about 10 areas of technology that would be getting particularly high investment from China, and it's often described in terms of billions of dollars. And I'd be interested in your observations, Michael, about how China's efforts have been coupled to the administration's initiative and your perception of the Chinese effort.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two threads there to pull on. I think that the first, which I think needs to be said, and I think to me is should be evidently apparent and probably communicated more often generally, is that the Chinese Communist Party is using artificial intelligence to track people in their country, to imprison ethnic minorities, to push forward a complete surveillance state, to maintain a great Chinese firewall and essentially restricting the content that Chinese people have access to. These are the use cases of artificial intelligence that are deeply in conflict with Western values. And this is something that we have tried to communicate and continue to communicate with our friends and allies in Europe. And there has never been more of an imperative than now to ensure that the US and our allies lead the world in artificial intelligence. We need to ensure that the next great technological breakthroughs are made here in the West and are underpinned by Western values. And I think if we don't lead, we run the risk of these values that are diametrically opposed to everything we believe in slowly permeating these new technologies and then being exported abroad. So that is why the imperative is so great. That is why the president signed an executive order launching the American AI Initiative. That is why we have pursued a whole of government approach over the last 3 years to ensure American leadership in artificial intelligence. And that is why we made the big announcement last Monday that many of you saw that we're committed to doubling non-defense AI spend by the federal government in the next 2 years. That is moving from about $1 billion to $2 billion of federally funded R&D in AI in the course of only 2 years. This is a massive and incredible step forward in our commitment to American leadership in this particular domain. And I think what's very important to remember, and so that's point one. I think point two, which you brought up, is sort of these commitments that have been sort of publicly asserted by the Chinese government. We believe that we have a lot of skepticism in the validity or veracity of those particular statistics. And I think I challenge, we have a lot of brilliant think tank people here, we have lots of journalists here. I challenge all of you to spend more time thinking about if you're attempting to report on action taken by the Chinese government to spend more money in AI, is that actually happening? Like, is it really, are they actually spending billions of dollars? Can we do more? Is that really a true statement? Can you compare that number to the number that Congress appropriates and is actually spent and put out the door by our agencies? And I think the short answer, the answer is no. And I think there needs to be a stronger and better and bigger conversation around the validity of those numbers. And I'd point you to 2 studies that came out. Georgetown, a great institution at CSET over there, a team led by Jason Matheny, put out a study last December that cast doubt on a lot of these numbers and said that in reality, they're definitely not spending tens of billions and spending a lot less than that. And that's the type of narrative that we need to make clear, because when we're trying to make comparisons around what the West is spending and how we're approaching our R&D ecosystem, we need to be actually comparing apples to apples.
It's a good point, and one of the things that I think ironically is going to render China's investment less successful is that in parallel with their Made in China 2025 initiative, they also have emphasized what they call civil-military fusion, which is an effort to extract the military applications of these advanced technologies. Both quantum sciences and AI are technologies that will have universal applicability, and trying to force feed the scientific effort into producing military advantage will have the more likely outcome that will produce neither military advantage nor advance the underlying science. So it is something of a limitation, and so I think we're likely to be more successful with this approach. And so I was very reassured by your observations about the scale of the increase. And having previously served in the Office of Management and Budget as an official there a number of years ago, one of the questions I always ask about public sector investment, which is easy to measure, is what are your expectations for the outcomes of this investment? And are there pertinent metrics? Are there formed expectations that might help shape public expectations about the scale of this investment?
Absolutely, and I think the best way to answer that is to kind of give a little bit of a description of the type of innovation ecosystem we have here in the United States and the role that the federal government and its agencies plays in driving innovation broadly in the United States. So what's very different than almost any other country in the world, and particularly in China, is the way that the federal government spends research and development dollars. We don't have a Ministry of Science that is doled out X number of dollars and there's decisions made on how to spend it. We have research and development happening across all of our federal agencies. So DARPA, for example, is doing incredible work more on the late stage applied side. You have the National Science Foundation that's appropriated roughly $8 billion a year to invest in early stage basic research done at a lot of our universities. There's a Department of Energy which has billions of dollars that are spent through their incredible national lab infrastructure. With National Institutes for Health, which does a lot of our biohealth-related research as well. So we have a very sort of diverse set of places, and each of them have their own sort of aspirational goals and pieces of the puzzle that they play. So in some ways, we're incentivizing and creating a free market of ideas around innovation. And the part that the federal government plays in the larger spectrum is that, generally speaking, the federal government is investing in early stage, pre-competitive, basic research and development. And that's very different than what the private sector does. And that's by design. So the types of research that the federal government generally approaches is a type of research that the private sector is not incentivized to do on their own. That is a gap that we try to fill. And we do it in a way where these ideas can come to life, and then they're taken up and absorbed by the private sector and brought to fruition and completion, and ultimately to commercialization. And I think a great example to show how our system is unique is this breakthrough that happened last year on quantum supremacy. So there's no doubt in my mind that someone in Beijing had sort of called upon someone else in China to achieve quantum supremacy before the United States did. We didn't make that call here in Washington to our community, yet the United States made that breakthrough first. And the question is why or how, and I think the story is actually pretty interesting. So the federal government invests in this early stage basic research. We made a commitment years ago to investing into a quantum lab at UC Santa Barbara. It's doing incredible work, and we continue to fund their early basic stage research that didn't have any commercial applications. Some breakthroughs were made. Google saw this. They said, wow, this is a great team. We could bring them on board. We could equip them with more resources that we have, more compute time, more whatever. They acquired essentially the group, brought them in-house, and that group was able to achieve what they believed was quantum supremacy. Now they had to prove that their device could actually be faster than a traditional computer. So who has the fastest supercomputers in the world? The federal government does at our national lab. So then they took their breakthrough and they went to the fastest supercomputer in the world that's run by the DOE, and they ran the test to prove that they actually had done it. So here you can see this incredible sort of virtuous cycle of all pieces of the ecosystem kind of working together, from federal government doing the early basic work, funding at academic institutions, moving into the private sector, and having to go back to the federal government ultimately for the final check. So this is the type of free market approach to innovation which has led to a breakthrough which is really world changing.
It's a very good observation. Having done some work with the national labs, one of the things that they've been able to do successfully that I think interacts in a particularly constructive way with this initiative, which is basically in the foundational science of artificial intelligence and quantum sciences, is they have extraordinary modeling and simulation capabilities. So the application of artificial intelligence or, say, quantum sensing, for example, can be put through a synergistic suite of modeling and simulation that contributes to the advance of the foundational science. And it's the foundational science that, of course, creates the technology. And on that particular point, I'd be interested in any of your observations about how U.S. AI and quantum sciences technology stacks up internationally.
Yeah, I mean, our take is we continue to lead the world in both domains, and there's a whole number of metrics. There's quite a number of metrics you could use to kind of come to this analysis. But generally speaking, we have the best institutions in the world. We have the most highly cited papers in the world. We have the most vibrant venture ecosystem in the world. We have the most private sector dollars invested in these domains in the world, and the list goes on and on. So I think in all the metrics, we continue to lead the world. The question is less about where we stack up today, but how do we maintain that leadership? And if you look at the president very intentionally, again, titled his executive order on artificial intelligence, maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence. And this is what we're doing through our national strategies. And generally speaking, whether it is in quantum and information science or in AI, we generally follow sort of a strategic approach that has four primary lines of effort. So the first line of effort is all around research and development leadership. So back to this question of the federal government spends a neighborhood of $150 billion a year on research and development. How do we coordinate those efforts in a way that will allow us to maximize the output of those dollars? And we do that through coordinating mechanisms, through prioritization. We've done a lot of effort on increasing R&D spending at the federal level to really historic levels with this $2 billion announcement last week, and the list goes on. Pillar two is around a regulatory approach. We want to remove barriers to AI innovation and to innovation broadly in these domains and create a regulatory environment which fosters and actually drives further and more innovation in these domains than otherwise possible. And we believe that our sort of product to allow that to happen was our regulatory principles that came out last January. And that's able to balance sort of the core important values of the United States with the necessity for some oversight of these technologies. The third line of effort is always around workforce. We deeply believe in the power of the American worker to help sustain and drive these technologies. So one, we need to create a pipeline for better talent so we can have the greatest quantum scientists and artificial intelligence experts here in the United States. And we have done that. And a great example of that is in our AIEO, the president directed our agencies to prioritize artificial intelligence in their grants and fellowships. So whether you're at the Department of Energy giving out grants to grad students, whether you're National Science Foundation, you will be prioritizing AI in a way that you weren't before President Trump took that action. The second piece of workforce is around preparing the American worker for the 21st century economy. How do we reskill and retrain Americans to be prepared to take advantage of these technologies in the workplace, especially in an environment where there will be some displacement as these technologies take hold. And pillar number four, which I think goes back to the very early part of our conversation, is around international engagement. We deeply believe that there must be strong ties between the U.S. and its allies on driving leadership in these particular technologies. If the West does not lead, we're essentially ceding this domain to other countries which have a set of values which are in direct conflict with ours. So we have done so at places like the OECD, in an administration that generally is very thoughtful around approaching multilateral agreements. We were able to get to the point where the U.S. signed on to the OECD AI principles. Those were something that we signed in May of last year, and that showed that we as Western democracies can come together and say these are the types of principles that need to underpin the way that AI is developed. And now from those principles, you can see individual countries actually manifesting those into regulations.
That's, I think, very relevant, and it ties to a question that often comes up with new technologies where the government is a major player in the investment in the foundational science. How do you see the ability of the government to enable a transfer of this technology to the civil sector users that would be able to evolve from the foundational science to the technology applications?
Absolutely. So I think this is something that the federal government has, I think, in some ways struggled with for decades, this idea of technology transfer. If a great innovation or basic research discovery is made at one of our national labs, how do entrepreneurial scientists and businessmen out in the private sector know that this exists, is able to identify this breakthrough has happened, bring it into their own domain, find private capital to build a company and spur it into something bigger. And that's an effort that we have worked on. The last administration had a very strong effort around technology transfer, and we've continued to prioritize that. I think the key is for us to be able to provide better and more clarity to the private sector on the inventory of the types of work that we're doing. And I think that has been a big effort, especially the Department of Energy, to making their labs more open and more open to the community to share the incredible work that is being done. So we continue to think it's a priority, and we are ready and willing to work with all private sector folks to kind of get to that point.
No, that's a very useful development, because the government laboratories tend to lack a lot of the channels for propagating the technology into to the civil sector, and now with your work and the implementation of the quantum legislation, be interested in see how you're getting on with it.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. I think as many of you know, the President signed the National Quantum Initiative Act in December of 2018, and that actually created the National Quantum Initiative here in the United States. And I think we're extraordinarily proud of that. That is the whole of government effort to achieve American leadership in quantum information science. I think we're very excited about the funding levels we've been able to achieve there. Congress authorized $1.2 billion over 5 years in the legislation. The President, in his budget last week, proposed $500 million alone in year 2021. So we're spending or proposing to spend a clip that's significantly higher than where Congress authorized, and we're very thrilled about that. But what's unique about that legislation, and goes back to what you were talking about, is it specifically called for the creation of quantum consortia around the United States. So by design, the places where a lot of this early stage research around quantum information science will happen, it must happen in an environment that includes the private sector and academia all sitting together at one institution. So bids are essentially, the request for information from the Department of Energy is out on 5 consortia that they're going to be funding over the next year, and they've pledged over $600 million over 5 years to building out those consortia.
That's great, because the ability of the technology to be transferred really depends on a mechanism like that. And one of the interesting things that I noticed in the fact sheet on the initiative was you've also proposed investing $25 million in the quantum internet, and be keen to see what your expectations are, given that the internet as we know it, with binary bits, was a product of innovation in ARPA, the predecessor of DARPA, almost 50 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first funding, what ultimately became the internet, was to create ARPANET, which was funded in 1969 by sort of the DARPA predecessor. And this was a really big deal for the country, and it showed how sort of creating a network that sort of connected government entities together could actually be something that was built into something bigger. And that's something that the Department of Energy is exploring now. This idea of being able to create a backbone for the future quantum internet that essentially begins with connecting a lot of our core national labs as the Department of Energy, and use that as a backbone, and then private sector companies can plug into it and build and expand. So DOE is running full steam ahead on this. We have a line item in our budget around this. We're excited to start doing the very critical R&D to start laying the foundations for it. There was a meeting in Manhattan a few weeks ago where we kind of brought together industry representatives, academics, and national lab representatives to start talking about and architecting what it would look like. We put out some of our first thoughts on OSTP, on, I guess, ostp.gov, our website, where you can see sort of a 2-pager we've put together on kind of what the future will hold for that. And I think we're very excited for what could happen. But I think there you can see it in an environment where we deeply believe in a private sector approach to innovation. We think there's a very important and critical role that the federal government can play, and being able to help sort of build that initial backbone between some of our national labs is an important role that we could step into.
That's good, and I think the idea of developing the backbone in the same way that when the ARPANET first became visible, then it attracted users who were able to overlay their agencies or even offices' mission on that infrastructure to facilitate its more rapid propagation. And
True. It sort of follows this general sort of theory of the case where the federal government should be focused on the types of activities which other parts of the innovation ecosystem are not incentivized to do on their own, whether it's building the initial backbone for a quantum internet, whether it's, for example, building and sustaining and maintaining supercomputing infrastructure. High performance computing is extraordinarily expensive. No company is going to create their own HPC infrastructure, but it's a critical role that the federal government can play to build that infrastructure, allow users to pay for runtime, and you sort of create a national asset which keeps giving to the community.
And one of the, say, unintended, but perhaps most important consequence of ARPANET, apart from its existence, is the creation of human capital to be able to develop, expand, and exploit the technology. So it's really a useful thing. And it just occurred to me that I'm remiss in reminding you of the notice on the display that if you have any questions, you can get them in via at least at this stage, the binary internet. And perhaps we can do better soon. Just one final line of question, may I be interested in what the reaction has been to the administration's initiative in the scientific community. Over the years, I've seen these government-led campaigns, let's say, have a varied response from the ostensible beneficiaries, and be interested to see what kind of response you're getting.
I think our response has generally been, in my opinion, pretty positive. We went through a fairly extensive policy process to sort of shape and ultimately create and launch the American AI Initiative. And we deeply believe that each part of the innovation ecosystem, whether in the private sector, whether you're in academia, whether you're in the federal government, all have a very important role to play. And the challenge we had was, how do we identify what are the different pieces or roles that what role each of those pieces play in building those into the initiative? So for us, we were very sort of maniacally focused on what assets does the federal government have that we can help turbocharge the other pieces of the ecosystem. For example, how do we make more of our HPC infrastructure available for AI compute time? That's something that only we can control, but it benefits the rest of the community. And we have actually showed a commitment towards increasing R&D dollars associated with artificial intelligence, and that's something that was a huge announcement last week. So I think general response has been positive, and I think for us, we continue to look for more commitments from other parts of the ecosystem similar to us. We have shown that we're willing to make the leap in an environment where we want to be fiscally responsible. We're able to find a way to prioritize these areas, and our call is to the rest of the community to step up as well.
Yeah. Well, both the quantum sciences and AI are ultimately things that deal with data, and one of the questions we received from some particularly energetic member of the panel the audience who didn't need instruction from the chair, submitted a very interesting dimension of this, which is your take on the statement from the EU yesterday about aspiring to localize the holding of data that comes from the data activity of, say, non-resident firms.
Yeah, the general position of the United States government has been, pushing back against efforts by foreign countries to pursue data localization rules, and it's something that we believe is actually a way that you can hinder innovation, and is not something that is actually able to help innovation. And so for us, we continue to believe that having a free flow of data is absolutely critical. Authoritarian regimes that want to repress their people will use data localization rules as excuses for pursuing those types of policies, and we don't need to give them an excuse to do so by doing it ourselves.
Another question that had come in is more of a projection of what your expectations might be if China is successful in taking the lead in the application of quantum sciences or AI. What do you think might be the consequences?
Well, I'm confident that the U.S. will maintain its leadership in AI, so there's no need to engage in that hypothetical.
Okay, well, the New York Times in particular has been running a series of interesting reporting on how the Chinese have applied their surveillance technologies, which use AI in particular to improve the accuracy of facial recognition and so forth. And they are using their involvement in the telecommunications systems also to have this as a sort of malevolent app that's attended to their involvement in the communication system in a way that is enabling them to propagate their surveillance system to elsewhere, not just in China, but in Africa and other parts of the world. So I think we've got a pretty compelling warning that the technology is moving rapidly, and it seems its most malevolent applications are the ones that are selected first rather than later. I think at this stage, I would like to also see if there are any questions from the floor that didn't make it into the electronic form. Do we have a mic?
Great school, Justina Capital. Michael, thanks for your great work. So we are really good at cutting edge research and higher education. What role does it play to lift the standards of basic education in the nation in your work? Thank you.
Oh, it could not be more critical. Creating a pipeline of American talent in these domains is absolutely imperative. One of the first actions that President Trump took in 2017 was a presidential memorandum that prioritized STEM education at the Department of Education, committing over $200 million towards, at least $200 million towards improved STEM ed programs. We continue to look for ways to create an environment where the next great AI researchers and quantum scientists are American and were educated here in the United States. And we think that it's something that we can continue to move the ball forward on. And what we've seen also is a lot of interest from the private sector in joining in that effort. So a lot of what we try to do is take efforts and initiatives that we're pushing forward and believe are national priorities and have them partner or paired with commitments from other parts of the innovation ecosystem to help build leverage. And what was exciting about that $200 million announcement in 2017 was that it was paired the next day with a $300 million commitment from some of the largest technology companies in the U.S. to support STEM education in the way that they can through their own types of programming and in-kind donations. And that's the kind of energy we want to see, and we want to continue to build that. One thing that our office is responsible for statutorily is a drafting of a 5-year strategic plan on STEM education that was published in 2018 for us, and we're sort of in the implementation phase. This is the second program since the second strategy since the law was passed. And this, again, looks at a whole of government approach. What's very unique about our innovation ecosystem, our R&D structure in the federal government, if you will, is that lots of agencies do it. And the same goes for STEM ed. It's not just the Department of Education. It's not just at NASA. It's pervasive around all of our agencies. And where the White House can play a role is bringing a lot of those folks together and making sure that the programs are working in alignment and making the biggest impact possible.
Good. We've had a couple of additional questions that have been submitted in electronic form. So first one, expand on China's use of AI to commit gross human rights abuses, what can the U.S. do to hold accountable the U.S. companies and universities that work alongside Chinese companies that fuels the abuse?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the action taken by the Commerce Department in adding to the entity list a number of Chinese companies which were complicit in and enabling the suppression of ethnic minorities in China, I think was a huge step for the country. And it's something that we need to continue to point to and bring more attention to. There are a number of technology companies in China that are being utilized to sort of pursue these human rights atrocities, and these need to be called out for what they are and added to entities list. Now, the question of U.S. engagement in some ways here, I think is a little bit tricky, and one that I care about deeply. I think there is an obligation among a lot of technology companies in the U.S. to be a lot more open-eyed and less naive and more cognizant of the types of activities that are happening when they're engaging in China. And this idea, you talked about it a lot, was this civil military fusion, this idea that even if you're conducting what you believe is sort of innocuous research as an American in China, that type of research is being used for all sorts of reasons in ways that you often can't even imagine. So for us, as we need to constantly remind folks, whether you're investors that are deciding to invest in Chinese startups, whether you're American companies that are trying to do business in China, there's a very prominent American company that was selling medical devices that was used to do sort of biometric analysis, and it was actually being used to sort of track and create a database of certain ethnic minorities. I mean, this is very tragic, and we shouldn't have American companies complicit in this type of behavior.
Yeah. Well, since the problem is so pervasive, I think we'll probably need some more detailed federal attention to it. One of the issues that always comes up when discussion of resources are engaged is in funding of AI and quantum sciences. Did the allocation of those resources result from a decrement in investment in some other part of science or scientific research that might be considered lower priority, or for whatever reason came out second to AI and quantum?
Yeah, generally speaking, our budget proposal for 2021 was a 6% increase overall for research and development from the 2020 proposed budget. So sort of the pie increased, and we spent a lot of that excess plus up in the areas that the president has prioritized.
Good. Well, we'll take some more questions from the floor. The gent with the beard.
I feel there's a fundamental flaw in your spectrum.
Name and association.
Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Your spectrum, there are times in which things are dual use. For example, you can use the exact same algorithm to detect heart arrhythmias as to detect flaws in the screw signatures of American submarines transiting the South China Sea. So you need two spectra. You need one spectrum in which it's pretty much single use, and you can measure the good-evil potential of that single use. And the other spectrum is this complex mix of good uses and bad uses, dual uses. And are you going to stop the proliferation of the arrhythmia detector so that the Chinese don't get their hands on the screw signature flaw detector? Can't you establish two spectrum to better get a handle on this problem?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very, very tricky issue. I think in the world of AI, you can think of sort of facial recognition software, the same type of facial recognition sort of technology that can be used to unlock your iPhone is the same time that sort of a company like Hikvision could use to identify certain folks and who they're trying to target. So generally speaking, yes, it's a very complicated topic, and I think kind of the best manifestation of it is the work that Commerce is doing on some of export controls relating to some of these emerging technologies. They were on the hook by Commerce Congress to look at export controls for particular emerging tech. They had a very sort of arduous and long process in trying to get stakeholder feedback on things like export controls on AI, like what does that even mean? How do you get your hands around the types of issues you bring up with so many dual use cases? And it continues to be tricky. It's not something we shouldn't think about, but it certainly is tricky.
Yes, sir.
I'm a retiree. I have two questions. Taiwan is in the forefront of the penetration or influence by China. So how can U.S. in the technology field to further cooperate with Taiwan? The other question is that the TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the world leader in the semiconductor manufacturing. And they supply a bunch of chips to China. Is there some specific term that being contemplated to not benefit the wrong use of those chips? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think generally the best way for me to answer that is to kind of go back to the main thesis of today, which is that we need to ensure Western leadership in next generation technological discoveries. And that requires us to have strong relationships with all of our allies across the world to work on kind of making sure that they are the homes for the next great technological discoveries, and that includes all of our allies around the globe.
Good. Well, I think we've hit our sell-by date on it. I know you have to get back to your day job, but we really appreciated your opportunity that you've offered here to explain what's been going on with this important investment, and we wish you well.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.